Hello everyone. I'd like to welcome you to the first lecture in the New Testament and just a brief overview to give you a sense of what the New Testament is and the kinds of ways that we're going to approach and read the New Testament as we continue throughout the semester. What is the New Testament? Well, I suspect that you could answer that question in multiple ways. For a lot of people in the church, the New Testament is Scripture. In that sense, it is a holy document. It's a document that guides our living and guides our ethos, our ethics, how we deal with people, how we understand God, how we see God acting in the world. And many churches use the New Testament for preaching and teaching and informing their congregations how they should understand their faith, and that's all wonderful to do theologically. What we're going to do in this class is to try to approach the New Testament theologically and historically. And discover what dimensions the text might have historically, and how understanding a little bit about the historical background of the communities that first read these texts or the individuals who wrote these texts, if we can understand something about that, then perhaps we could also begin to tease out a deeper understanding of what the text might mean to contemporary communities today. And as we engage in this kind of study, we're going to be asking the questions of what potential problems or issues could arise. Critical analysis may lead us to question some things and may lead us to understand some new things, and we'll be dealing with that as we go throughout the semester. From a historical perspective, I think it's very important to understand that the cultural world was a world very different from ours. The cultural world of the New Testament, in which these documents were written and first read and understood. If you think about Jesus' world in ancient Palestine, it was a largely agrarian peasant society, a society that had been overtaxed, doubly taxed by Caesar and Rome, but also taxed by the Herodians, the Jewish kings, or so-called Jewish kings. In many ways, it was a very difficult place to live. Most people probably did not have the kinds of luxury that we have. You think about how long people lived, the health issues that they dealt with, and of course the lack of electricity and lights and power and communication, everything that we take for granted. It was also a very conflicted world, a world in which Palestinian Jews were in conflict with outside forces from the wider, broader Greco-Roman world. Jesus was born into this vortex and came with a new message for his people that caught fire, really, and went viral, we might say, throughout the entire Roman Empire in a very short time. How did all that happen? We'll be asking those historical questions. And then, as we think about how the New Testament documents were written and to whom they were written, how was this word spread throughout the Greco-Roman world? Why did it catch fire? Why did it go viral? What about it might be useful for understanding our lives and our communities today? But in order to do that, we have to have some historical and cultural understanding. Now, What is the New Testament? Basically, it's 27 documents composed separately by 15 or 16 different authors. These documents were composed between 50 and 120 AD or CE. And they're of different genres. What is a genre? Well, I'm going to let you pause and look that up if you don't know already. And if you want to pause this and think very quickly about the layout of the New Testament, describe what genres you find there as you go through the different documents. How would you describe those genres? Narrative, letter, what would you call them? I'll let you pause, think through that, and we'll start here in a second. Okay, I hope you've had an opportunity to think about the New Testament and its literary forms. To answer the basic genre question, we have 4 Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. That Gospel, we'll talk more about what that means as a genre, but it's basically narrative in nature. It's a story about Jesus' life. The other large narrative in these texts is the Acts of the Apostles, which was written also by the author who wrote Luke. And it's about the early church, the history of the early church. It is narrative in nature. Starting with Romans and going throughout the epistles, we have a bunch of letters. Letters written to communities and to individuals in the earliest century, the first century. And then we have, at the end, well, Hebrews, I guess you could call a sermon. And then you have apocalyptic literature, which is Revelation, a completely different genre altogether. So we've got at least 4 or 5 different genres. And then we have all these subgenres within the New Testament books. We have, for example, the subgenre of miracle stories. A whole bunch of stories about miracles performed by Jesus and others in the Gospels and Acts. In Paul's letters, he quotes psalms. He quotes songs that we know of. And so there you have subgenres within the letters themselves, right? So you can look throughout the New Testament and find all kinds of literary forms. Like I said, it's 27 different documents written by 15 or 16 different authors. All of the New Testament is in one language. It is in Greek. It is in a special kind of Greek called Koine Greek, which is the Greek of the Common Era during Jesus' and Paul's lifetime. So it's not the classical Greek of Plato and Aristotle. It's a Greek that one might say is a little bit dumbed down from the classical Greek that was used by contemporary people to communicate. We'll be talking throughout the semester about the relationship between the New Testament and the Old Testament. Just keep in mind that the Old Testament was scripture for Jesus, and it was scripture for his first followers. But what's unique about that is they read, likely, at least the followers of Jesus, Paul and other followers, read the Greek Old Testament, which was translated in Alexandria around 250. The abbreviation for the Greek Old Testament is called the Septuagint, is LXX, the Roman numeral for 70. And that goes back to a legend in the book of Letter of Aristeas. It's an extra-testamental book about how the Septuagint was written. And the idea was that 70 or 72 scribes copied the exact same Old Testament documents in 72 days, right? And each one of them copied the whole Old Testament, and they came up with the exact same version, right? Totally miraculous, right? This was, though, the standard biblical text for Jews in the New Testament period who were outside of the traditional homeland of Israel. So if you were in the diaspora, say in Alexandria, in Greek, in Egypt, or in Greece, or in Rome, your community likely spoke Greek and read the Septuagint. And so that's why the New Testament writers used this document, because most of the early communities, apart from the very earliest times of Jesus' followers, many of the communities really flourished in Greco-Roman city-states in the East, particularly around Asia Minor and in Greece. These were Greek-speaking communities, and they needed a Greek translation of the Old Testament to use for Scripture, and so that's what they use. And so when the New Testament quotes Scripture, it quotes the Greek translation of the Old Testament. And we have a lot of quotations. It's very interesting to see, both in the Gospels as well in Paul, that they're quoting the Greek translation of the Old Testament. And what's interesting is sometimes the translation varies from what we have in the Hebrew, which is what the Jewish community reads today and what we read as part of our translation of the Old Testament. So sometimes you have some confusion about that, and that's very interesting. We'll get into that. Some words are translated into the Greek differently from what we have in Hebrew, and then when we translate it in the New Testament, it reads differently than the Old Testament text that it's referring to, because the Old Testament is, our English Old Testament is a translation of the Hebrew text. I know that's confusing. If you have questions about it, ask me about it. But it's really important to keep in mind, the early churches, the earliest believers, read the Greek Old Testament, the Septuagint. It's also important to keep in mind that the New Testament documents reflect a lot of diversity. The early Christians were ethnically and theologically diverse. There were at least two main ethnic groups, Gentiles and Jews. And they had different backgrounds theologically. And then we see that various communities, I think probably each of the Gospels has a separate community or communal context. Certainly the Gospel of John has a community and very certain way of writing and thinking theologically, but I think also Matthew is writing to a separate community, Mark. But it's interesting to see that part of the New Testament, what we see in the New Testament, is a reflection of conflict between these two main groups, between Gentile Christians and Jewish Christians, but also conflicts more broadly in sort of just a very diverse ethnic groupings that were part of the early Christian movement. And so part of what we see working out is, how are we going to proclaim one faith? How are we going to proclaim unity when we are so diverse, when we do have such different backgrounds? By the time you get to the 2nd century, we had even more diverse Christian groups, right? What some scholars would call heretics. Different folks who viewed the New Testament heritage differently. The Ebionites from the Gnostics, from the Marcionites, and then the group that the church aligns with today, the Proto-Orthodox, who are all these different people, and in part, their discussions are shaping how we understand theologically what is part of the New Testament. Indeed, as we'll see in our lecture on the canon, the Gnostics and the Marcionites and others, they shaped the canon indirectly by how the early church, the Proto-Orthodox movement, rejected the Gnostic and Marcionite interpretations and their Gospels and said, we're not going to read those as our canon, right? And so we have a heritage that reflects a community struggling with its diversity. And it's very interesting now that in our times, when there is so much discussion about diversity and its meaning, that these documents can maybe teach us a little bit about what unifies us theologically and how do we struggle with our traditions, our ethnic identities, our heritage, as we come into this new understanding. It's also important to understand that these New Testament documents are not the only Christian documents from the earliest period. We have a number of Gospels and Apocalypses and other pieces of Christian fiction, mostly later from the 1st century. We have a bunch of Coptic and Gnostic Gospels from the 2nd century. And of course, the early apostolic fathers who were part of this tradition were commenting on these texts. These are not included in our New Testament. We have a huge diversity. This was a rich writing community, especially starting in the 2nd century and onwards. They were really involved in understanding and interpreting these documents in various ways. The Apostolic Fathers would have very different ways of interpreting Scripture than the Coptic Christians and others. So I think it's important to understand that we only have a small slice, and that's intentional. The early church really decided which of these documents it would include in its canon. Your next lecture will be about that process. But I think it's important to know that there's other stuff out there, and it's available for you to read. Most of it is freeware. You can download it and read it. Some things you may have to purchase. Really good translations you'd have to purchase. But you can read a lot of this stuff if you have the time and the interest. It's fascinating. Fascinating stuff. Throughout the semester, we'll be moving along a line that is between scholarly and devotional approaches. I will give you the scholarly, you probably will bring some of the devotional, and we will try to coordinate these. Sometimes it's possible. My hope is theologically you'll be able to integrate and synthesize these by the time that you're finished with this class. But I think it's important to know that they are different approaches to the New Testament and to understand what that means. And I'll be talking as we go along the class about various analytical methods we can use for biblical research, historical criticism. We'll have a lecture today on textual criticism, various kinds of biblical criticism. One of the tests that we're going to have throughout this semester is how do you coordinate reading the text critically with our own spiritual concerns. And that really is going to be up to you to do. I'll give you my perspective occasionally as an ordained minister. But it'll be up to you to figure out how do I integrate all of this analytical, scholarly work into my own understanding of who I am and who I am called to be. Okay, I hope this was a useful lecture for you, and I hope you get something out of the other lectures if I'm asking you to view them as you move forward with this class. Thank you so much.